Defence Dialogue, a podcast discussing contemporary challenges in the area of European security and defence. Brought to you by the Martens Centre with Nicholas Novacki.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies Defence Dialogue podcast series. I'm very happy to be discussing a topical issue with you again today, which is the topic of the European Union's resilience. And with me today, we have my colleague Alvaro de la Cruz, the Martens Centre's communications and new media officer. Welcome, Alvaro. It's very, very nice to have you here.
Hello, Nicholas. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me.
So the topic of resilience, this is something that has become a strategic priority for the European Union, also in the field of security and defense. And if you remember, in the 2016 EU Global Strategy, it emphasized the need for the EU to promote resilience, especially in its southern and eastern neighborhood. But under the EU's current leadership, the EU's resilience building efforts have become more internal focused. And this has to do with multiple things like increased great power competition, the COVID-19 pandemic, concerns about the future of democracy, new technologies, disinformation, cyber attacks, etc. So a broad range of issues there. The EU has also launched several notable initiatives and strategies that have a prominent resilience dimension. These include the European Democracy Action Plan, the Digital Services Act proposal, the Security Union Strategy, the EU Cybersecurity Strategy, and the Resilience Strategy in the EU's external action. And we also know from the findings of the first comprehensive threat analysis that the EU conducted to serve as a basis for this forthcoming strategic compass that there really is quite a bit of threats and challenges that the EU needs to address, also by becoming more resilient to various different types of external shocks and challenges. So basically, the Union is also hoping to advance its resilience agenda through the forthcoming strategic compass, which is a German initiative that was developed in the run-up to Germany's autumn 2020 EU Council presidency. The strategic compass is currently in its strategic dialogue phase, which runs for the first half of this year, and then it will be drafted in the second half of 2021 and adopted in the spring 2022 during the French EU Council presidency. And the compass has four overall aims. These are enhancing and guiding the implementations of the EU's existing level of ambition, contributing to the development of a common European strategic culture, defining policy orientations, specific goals, etc., in different fields, and providing guidance to the existing initiatives that have been launched since 2016. So things like permanent structured cooperation, the coordinated annual review on defense, the European Defense Fund, and the European Peace Facility. And in the field of security and defense, the strategic compass seeks to make existing resilience-related instruments more operational, and then to add also to the efforts that the EU and its member states will have to make in that field to increase their overall resilience. And basically, the compass has four overall baskets. One of is the resilience basket, and I think this will be by far the broadest of the four strategic compass baskets. And this is, of course, because resilience itself is an extremely broad concept. The EU Global Strategy defined it as the ability of states and societies to reform, thus withstanding and recovering from internal and external crises. So virtually everything that the EU does at the moment has acquired a resilience dimension, not just in the field of security and defense. Because of the challenges that I mentioned earlier. There was, for example, a Franco-Dutch non-paper that was published a couple of months ago that discussed the need to boost the resilience of the EU single market as well, for example, to ensure that the EU can be an effective actor. And we know that the resilience basket seeks to secure the EU's access to the global commons, so things like the seas, cyber domain, space, assess the EU strategic vulnerabilities in security and defense, and also enhance mutual assistance and solidarity among the member states. And these are, of course, vital to the protection of the Union and its citizens, which is part of the level of ambition that the EU has in security and defense, which was outlined by the 2016 implementation plan on security and defense. And in a way, I mean, the EU's kind of quest for greater resilience, is also linked to the issue of deterrence, which is something that you generally discuss in the framework of NATO, and deterrence being the ability of states to kind of prevent hostile acts from a third country by issuing a threat that would then make that action too costly for them to cover. But resilience is a softer entry point that allows the Union to kind of take care of these kind of different types of challenges by boosting its own ability to cope with external shocks and challenges, and then making it harder also for potentially hostile third countries to influence or attack the Union. And finally, it's also important to note that the strategic compass will not address resilience exclusively in the context of the resilience basket. The other three baskets will have a resilience dimension, interestingly, as well. The crisis management basket, for example, will have to address the resilience of the EU civilian and military operations against things like disinformation. The capabilities basket will have to increase the EU's resilience by reflecting on the impact of new technologies, such as artificial intelligence and autonomous weapon systems. And then the partnerships basket will have to boost the resilience of the EU's partners against things like hybrid threats, for example. So kind of overall, I think resilience is likely to be one of the strategic compass's overarching themes. And in the end, it could even kind of become the EU's resilience compass in the field of security and defense, because the resilience aspect is likely to be so heavy, so dominant in it.
Thank you, Nicholas. Indeed, this is a huge aspect of every discussion in Brussels on EU capitals right now, regardless of if it concerns typical defense or modern threats. As you mentioned, resilience is a very broad concept, and of course, not only is it a broad concept for the European Union officials, it is a very ambiguous or different concept depending on who you ask it about. So, for example, if we discuss resilience, the European resilience in the Baltics states, member states, they will feel resilience affects different things that if you ask, for example, southern Mediterranean states, and we'll focus on, of course, migration and other threats like in the Baltics. But also it depends a lot on the age group of people you ask, because probably young Europeans will be more concerned about cyber attacks than probably over 60 or 65-year-old Europeans are. So do you think the European Union should probably start with some communication and education campaign on what are the common threats to our security in different levels, so people around the European Union have a better understanding of actually what are the threats, even if they feel far away from their day-to-day lives, so we can focus on priorities that actually are important for all of us as a whole.
I think these are very interesting points that you raised, and I think there's a lot of merit in kind of discussing common threats and challenges, or creating a perception of common threats and challenges within different European societies. And one way of kind of doing this would be to kind of also perhaps discuss these issues in the context of the current conference on the on the future of Europe, which I think would create an excellent ready-made platform for this sort of thing. It's a pity that the comprehensive threat analysis that the EU produced for the strategic compass is classified. So the only thing we have on the threat analysis is a very sanitized 2-page memo that the External Action Service published when it was when the analysis itself was being discussed in the Council. But I think we definitely kind of need to create a more kind of harmonious, a more common perception of the challenges that we face. And indeed, I think like there would have to be kind of discussions like within different member states, like first of all, and then there would have to be kind of discussions between different people from different member states at the European level. And like I said, I think the conference on the European future of Europe like could really or should have like some sort of session, some kind of format in which like ordinary citizens like from different member states to come together, discuss kind of what they consider as the main kind of resilience related like threats and challenges that their societies face. Because indeed, like you said, I mean, people from the Baltic states are likely to have very, very different perceptions to those coming from like the South, for example, and this is completely understandable. But the key is indeed that like we kind of create a greater sense of solidarity and like try to understand like where the people from those countries other than our own come from, and like why they consider that those are the greatest priorities for them.
Definitely, I think if the discussion is still whether we need to make a more transparent and democratic union, of course, these kind of topics should involve social, civil society and involve citizens indeed in the conversations, and of course, openness of our debates and papers while discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. But if I can just add to that, I mean, the kind of the one kind of big challenge, like when it comes to kind of trying to like create a more harmonious or more common perception about like threats and challenges, obviously that it takes a huge amount of time. It's not something that usually like happens overnight. Like because it relates to the issue of strategic culture, and like strategic culture is something that is informed first of all by geography, because like a country like Finland will also always have a little bit of a different perception of its threats and challenges compared to Spain, for example, by virtue of geography. And then secondly, by history. Like history is also a very important like factor in exchanging this, and historical experiences also take a long time to change. What can happen is that there can be kind of a sudden shock to a system, like, for example, the 2008 financial crisis, the 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia, or the COVID-19 pandemic that like we're currently like experiencing, and like through those sudden shocks, like we create a more common perception of how threats and challenges should be informed. But of course, like in the field of security and defense, like you would never wish for a major shock to happen, because usually those are quite dramatic. And like absent of a sudden shock that would kind of facilitate the emergence of a more common European perception, I think we have to indeed kind of work in the area of citizen engagement and like put people in the same room, make them understand like where they're coming from, to kind of facilitate this process in a more gradual and a more gentle way.
I couldn't agree more. Of course, our audience may say, well, you communication officers are always insisting in communication campaigns. Maybe it is our endogamic thing, but I think it is crucial in this sense to come to a common ground in the field of resilience. And of course,
I wouldn't trust this like to EU communications people, because I mean anything that would come, any official communication coming from the Union would be so dry that it would be uninteresting. So the key is really to kind of make this a thing, make this a consultation among ordinary people, not led by kind of EU communications people, because those communications will be so sanitized, so dull and so dry that they will be uninteresting to anybody.
Well, if I can think about one threat that probably every European now feels as important, regardless of their age and location. Of course, because of the timely issue, I think it would be the sanitary crisis and how we had a disruption of goods and services because of our vulnerabilities, especially when it comes to the dependency on a limited set of suppliers. For example, we saw that 80% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients are today produced outside of the Union, and that shown how weak the European Union can be to face one of these crises. So I think that is something that wherever you go in Europe now feels like a real threat, like a real vulnerability for Europe. How do you think we can bring back the production of essential services, goods, and these kind of products? For example, medicine, but also of course technical tools and also different electronic systems that are keen for hospitals, for example. We had this conversation after World War II, and we decided we needed an agricultural common policy to not be dependent on the exterior, and Europe will never suffer again hunger. How do we make sure Europe will never depend on the exterior and suffer from lack of supplies in these kind of fields?
Well, it's a good question, and but I don't think we can become kind of totally independent of the external world, like even after the coronavirus crisis. And if you think that we would basically kind of have something like the common agricultural policy in every aspect of EU trade, for example, that would basically like turn the European Union into this kind of protectionist like giant that would probably cause more to damage international trade at a time like when like trying to promote global recovery and trying to restore economic connections is one of the utmost priorities of countries around the world. And I think kind of this way, although it might kind of sound attractive at first, I think in the long term, it would probably cause more damage. However, it's absolutely true that we have to kind of look at Europe's like strategic vulnerabilities in key areas like medicines production, like which you mentioned. And like I'm not a technical expert on trade or production of medicine, so it's difficult kind of to say like which aspects of the supply chain or medicines production, for example, like would absolutely like have to be brought back to Europe for Europe to have a more resilient system regarding medicine production. But it certainly like does need to kind of have a look at its supply chain and like make sure that like it gets like if it cannot in the short term like start producing all the key ingredients of imported medicines like back in Europe, that it at least kind of diversifies its supply chains, because the current system, for example, in which a lot of the key active ingredients for many imported medicines like come from China and India, and if we're confronted with this another sudden health crisis, like we saw like during the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, that those supply chains are extremely vulnerable, like when this is like a sudden spike in demand. So I think kind of we need to balance the desire of like bringing these supply chains like back to Europe with diversification. I think that's one point. Like not all of them can probably realistically be brought back to Europe. So we at least need to make sure that the range of external suppliers that we use consists of a broader group of countries. I think the second key aspect is that like Europe also kind of develops a more effective security of supply strategy. And what I mean by security of supply is that like Europe kind of develops a way of thinking about like in advance and like planning in advance, like for a sudden shock that would like cause like serious disruption in society. Strategic stockpiling, I think, is one really key aspect in this. The Commission has already developed these RESC-EU stockpiles, like that are hosted by a number of EU member states, in which like key medicines, health equipment, etc., are stored and like which can be used not only by the host country, but they can be used by other member states, like in the event of a sudden health crisis. So I think kind of strategic stockpiling, not only in the area of kind of health equipment and medicines, is a very positive thing. And we should kind of think what other kind of material and equipment might be like critical and like the supply of which might get disrupted in a future crisis. I mean, at the moment, for example, we're also facing a shortage of microchips. So perhaps like we should also consider kind of stockpiling things like microchips to make sure that Europe's industry would have a relatively steady supply of them, like even if the normal kind of global supply chains are suddenly disrupted due to shortages.
Indeed, what a position we find ourselves in to decide whether to continue boosting free trade and liberal politics, or to go to protectionism and be safe. It's a tough decision indeed. I wanted to.
like just to kind of add one thing to that. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't think kind of protectionism is necessarily like synonymous with safety.
Yeah.
And I think kind of history has shown usually that when you have economic links and like connections like between like different countries, economic interactions like generally promote like safety and stability, because like countries have an interest in maintaining like those economic ties. They might not promote democracy as some hoped. We saw that like with China, but like generally speaking, kind of trade links and open and free trade like is good for like global stability and security. And usually protectionism is negative for global stability.
Global stability used to depend a lot in the past on the let's say American leadership, and many Europeans thought that our resilience will be regained again once the Biden administration took office. But after more than 3 months in office, we don't see that the American approach towards international security and defense cooperation with Europe is going to change that much. Do we have already the final wake-up call to start investing independently and not always keep hoping for the Americans to take care of our defense and resilience?
I think it depends on like who you ask, like who you ask, and like from which country in Europe that person comes. But the good thing is that the Biden administration is clearly a lot more positive about like what the EU is trying to do in the field of security and defense than the previous Trump administration. The Biden administration is quite supportive of the European Defense Fund, for example. They're also very supportive and interested in the permanent structured cooperation framework. The US, for example, like became one of the first third countries that was admitted into the PESCO project on military mobility, like together with Norway and Canada. And the administration is like looking to join like potentially other PESCO projects like later this year, that would like, which is fantastic, because it also like shows those countries that are concerned about the potential dangers of EU defense cooperation to NATO and the transatlantic ties, that like there's no need to worry about this because the US is kind of fully on board. But I think kind of regardless of like who sits in the White House and regardless of how pro or anti-European like that person like might be, I mean, ultimately, like Europe really like does need to like do more in these areas, like not just resilience, but more broadly in the area of security and defense. And that's partly obviously like to ensure that it's able to like take care of different types of threats and challenges in its own geographical neighborhood, but also because, I mean, we don't know, I mean, exactly, I mean, what's going to happen in the future, and we need to prepare for the worst outcome. I mean, it's clear, it has been clear for quite some time that the main kind of focus of American foreign policy, foreign and security policies in the Indo-Pacific region. And China is the main concern of the US. And this means that like Europe, like although not an unimportant region, like for the Americans, like the importance of Europe like will certainly like decrease even further going forward. So Europe needs to be prepared like for the eventuality that like there might, although like we do not wish for this, that there might be a conflict between the Americans and the Chinese at some point in the future. And then if there is such a conflict, I mean, we have to also like think of things like, I mean, could Russia perhaps kind of use like that point in time in international relations to try to advance its own interest by for example, annexing a bit of eastern Ukraine, or like trying to cause like havoc within the European Union itself. And if we cannot totally kind of count on the US ability to fight two major conflicts against two major great powers, basically, we have to kind of make sure that Europe is at least kind of more prepared than it currently is to kind of counter threats on its own continent. Otherwise, anything else would be totally unresponsible, in my opinion.
Well, I think that could be a very nice closing point. Europe could and should be prepared, and I think we have the resources and the intelligence to do so. So let's hope for the best.
Yeah, no, we have to hope for the best, and like we'll see what will happen going forward. But thanks a lot again, Alvaro, for joining me in this podcast. It was very pleasant to have this discussion with you today. I really appreciate it. And I also appreciated all of you who joined online and took the time to listen to an episode of this podcast. And we'll make sure to have another episode of you, for you, like sometime in the coming weeks and months. And in the meantime, I would like to wish you a very pleasant summer and a very pleasant day wherever you are.
That was today's episode of Defence Dialogue. Subscribe to our podcasts for more.